We're talking about lethal retribution.
All kinds of murders, people tied up and people getting shot.
They were able to live in that world and not have a second thought about it.
There was blind ambition that drove these three women.
To have a woman as the head of the organization is very rare.
They are mothers working in a man's world, but that's not stopping them.
Rosalie Garcia ordered up murders and sold hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of drugs.
Heroin may be cheaper out here on the street, but heroin-related crimes continues to go up.
Beatriz started to deal ecstasy.
You decide, hey, forget this amphetamine stuff, I'm going to get into cocaine.
Sandra Avila Beltran. She was as ruthless as any male drug trafficker.
She bedded one kingpin after another. She even bedded 2 law enforcement officials. Both of them were murdered.
Most men in the business tend to underestimate the woman sitting across the table from them.
When you're dealing with someone as big as these women, chances are something bad's going to happen to you.
Now on Gangsters, Lethal Beauties, Rosalie Garcia, Sandra Beltran, and Beatrice Hanau.
This statute begins to focus the proper attention on the need to get to the kingpins.
Drug kingpin.
It's kind of hard to succinctly define kingpin. They ran organizations. They were big time.
Assassin.
Cocaine cowboys.
Drug kingpins.
Drug kingpin.
Kingpin.
There's a glass ceiling everywhere. You know, if you can make a company money, if you can make a drug trafficking organization money, there's a place for you. If you're intelligent, they don't care. We have all kinds of women that are running big companies, and in the world of crime, it's the same sort of principle. Many of them will never rise too high, just like in legitimate society. Then you'll have the queenpins.
Queenpins are rare. They're not as prevalent as the male version kingpins. However, you do have exceptions. There was blind ambition that drove these three women.
Rosalie Garcia, Sandra Beltran, and Beatrice Hanau. Lethal beauties from different corners of the world who dealt in destruction. Heroin, cocaine, and amphetamines. Each would attract willing young men to do their bidding. There is the Queen of the Pacific, a cocaine heiress. The Queen of Amphetamines, a Colombian working abroad. And Shorty, a heroin queenpin from the Bronx. And each would be hunted down like the kingpins who came before them.
This was a case that was sort of like a history lesson of drug use in the Bronx.
Heroin was big in the late 60s and through the 70s. Crack obviously exploded in the mid-80s, but heroin was sort of always around at a lower level.
It's sad to say it, but New York is a very large center of heroin abuse.
DEA had monitoring programs. We could see that even with the emergence of crack cocaine on the street, heroin, very high purity, was plentiful on the market. That fueled a lot of turf battles and, various gang rivalries and the violence as well.
In the age of crack, Rosalie Garcia specialized in heroin, right under the nose of the law.
This is the Hunts Point section of the Bronx. We're coming up on 914 Hoe Avenue. This is where Rosalie Garcia plied her trade.
In the late 1990s, this may have been the most dangerous apartment building in all of New York.
about a dozen murders in this one building alone. Detectives talk about a killing in the lobby where there's so much gun smoke they couldn't even find the victim when they came.
At one point, there was a rooftop sniper who was picking off people on the ground.
Back in 1998, cops were chasing a suspect across the rooftop here, and he jumped and fell to his death right down in the lobby here, 914 Ho.
The violence was happening 1 block over from a schoolyard. And only a few blocks away from the famed 41st Precinct. The police station was given a nickname in the 70s by the cops who worked this beat. It was a lonely outpost in a neighborhood overrun with murder, drugs, and gang warfare. They called it Fort Apache. In the early 1970s, Fort Apache, the Bronx, averaged between 120 and 130 homicides a year. 20 years later, Rosalie Garcia took the legendary name and ran with it.
The White House has released a report saying that United States heroin use is at its all-time low, but the report contradicts what's going on right now in New York City.
She was the head of a street heroin operation in the Bronx.
She would get wholesale heroin, cut up the heroin. They had actually put stamps on the heroin, Fort Apache. It was sort of a way to sort of mock the local police department.
The Ho Avenue gang sold Fort Apache in tiny $10 bags in open defiance of the law.
It was a street corner business. It was every day. It was daily. It was in lobbies of apartment buildings. It was nonstop.
Authorities believed they were selling $10 bags to the tune of $60,000 to $70,000 a week.
Heroin may be cheaper out here on the street, but the high cost of heroin-related crimes continues to go up.
This was a ruthless gang. Hitmen with body armor. They had drug pitchers going out on the street selling, $10 stamps of heroin. For 10, 15 years, it was a very productive crew.
The mastermind was a pint-sized gangster known as Shorty. Her name was Rosalie Garcia, and she ran these streets for more than a decade. She solidified her reputation in 1994, ending a 3-month gang war by ordering the killing of 2 of her rivals. It happened in a shootout in the lobby of her own building.
Prosecutors say she killed off her rivals because it was so lucrative.
Authorities say she ordered her son to take out a rival by handing him a bag of guns and telling him to make sure to do it right. Manuel Roman pistol-whipped the man in public before another member of the crew shot him in the street.
Her son kind of helped run that organization with her, so it was kind of a mother-son bizarre thing.
We talked to residents there at the time.
They really were paralyzed, trapped in their own building for many years.
With the profits, she and her son opened legitimate businesses in the neighborhood. A dry cleaners and a pool hall to help launder the drug money. Authorities also say they hired a Santeria priestess to cast a spell in order to reveal their enemies. By the late 1990s, members of her crew were snared by police. They began turning on the boss.
I think with Rosalie, the breadth of this operation, it had grown to such proportions, and it was getting so out of hand with the killings and everything else that they had to move in.
She was indicted in 2001 and charged with murder and running a continuing criminal enterprise.
I mean, it just doesn't compute when you walk into the Manhattan Federal Court. You know, how we've glorified gangsters in movies and TV. It's not the appearance that you usually have of what the head of a murderous drug gang should look like.
Charged as the ringleader in a far-reaching racketeering case involving heroin distribution and 4 counts of murder, Rosalie Garcia, barely 5 feet tall, appeared pouty-faced and apologetic to the judge.
She claimed that drug addiction was the motivating factor in all this. The judge pretty much rejected that, said that drug addiction is not a defense to murder.
Guilty, on all counts. A lethal beauty who ran her neighborhood like a mob boss. Shorty is now serving a life sentence.
Rosalie Garcia really destroyed life for a lot of people in this neighborhood for many years. You know, this place was just gripped by fear. But New York is a resilient place, and New Yorkers are resilient, and that's why this neighborhood is sort of coming back now.
While Rosalie Garcia never left her fiefdom near Fort Apache, the Bronx, two other notorious female gangsters plied their trade on the global stage.
Her nickname was La Negra, thick, dark hair, very distinctive. She was clearly in control and in charge.
If you're the queen of the Pacific, you need to get the queen's permission before you start moving product through there.
The South American and Latin American drug trade, the level of atrocities being committed would be war crimes anywhere else. In both the cases of Sandra Beltran and Beatrice Henao, they were able to live in that world and not have a second thought about it.
Let there be no mistake. If you sell drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be prosecuted. And once you're convicted, you will do time.
Throughout the 1990s, one of the most ruthless gangsters in the Bronx weighed under 100 pounds and stood maybe 5 feet tall in heels. Her name was Rosalie Garcia, and she was put away for life on heroin distribution and murder charges.
To have a woman as the head of the organization is very rare.
Women can run these criminal enterprises. They're just as intelligent as men. They can become as ruthless as men. And they really understand strategic partnerships that allow them to operate in a male-dominated environment.
The most famous female gangster formed one of the most notorious partnerships in crime history.
There have always been women involved in organized crime and in criminal actions. You can go all the way back to the likes of Bonnie and Clyde.
Her name was Bonnie Parker. Her partner was Clyde Barrow. They committed more than 100 felony criminal acts, including kidnapping, armed robbery, assault, and murder. Pictures discovered during their Depression-era crime spree made Bonnie an instant femme fatale.
They would be eaten for lunch, for breakfast, by the Mexican gangs and the South American gangs today.
A lethal beauty, nicknamed La Negra, for her brazen looks and brunette hair, came out of Colombia in the late 1990s. Her name was Beatrice Elena Henao. Indicted for drug trafficking and money laundering, she would rise to become a top lieutenant for the Comba cartel, a main supplier of Colombian cocaine into Mexico. Her story starts on the streets of Amsterdam, where she was leading a nondescript life.
There's no history of her having been in the drug trade in the 80s or 90s. But we do know is she married a Dutchman and got citizenship in the Netherlands and moved over there and actually started a dry goods store for a while.
Apparently it wasn't enough. Authorities believe she also started a cell of international smugglers, intent on moving large amounts of drugs into the United States.
What is clear is that she met a Russian speed amphetamine dealer. Her bad luck, he was an undercover officer.
The undercover was from Germany. He had, I think, taken some Russian or something in college, so he was posing as a Russian. The case of Beatrice Henao came to my attention sometime in the summer of 2001. It was an ecstasy case, a very big ecstasy case.
Ecstasy, also known as XTC, is an amphetamine and one of the most widely used illicit drugs in the world.
It had been big since the late 90s with the raves and the clubs in New York City in particular. At that time, individual ecstasy pills would sell for anywhere from $20 to $30 when sold individually in a club.
In 1996, a federal investigation indicted Peter Gatien, king of the New York nightclubs, and charged him with selling ecstasy inside the famed Limelight. He was acquitted in 1998, but the case made ecstasy into a frontline narcotic in the war on drugs.
The Netherlands are the principal source of supply for ecstasy in the world.
Enter La Negra.
She was the leader of a cell of Colombians living in the Netherlands that was trying to ship ecstasy, a large amount of ecstasy, to the United States.
Authorities believe it was a three-way deal.
They were going to ship cocaine from Colombia to the Netherlands, and then ecstasy from the Netherlands to New York City, and then obviously the proceeds always go back to the owners in Colombia.
Beatrice brokered the deal, the biggest ecstasy shipment U.S. authorities had ever heard of, with the undercover agent.
What was ingenious about this case was, from the law enforcement perspective, was that the German undercover was posing as a transporter. You know, you've seen the Jason Statham movies. This guy, his role was supposed to be, I'm the transportation guy. I'm going to smuggle it into the U.S. for you, which was great because then we didn't have to worry about how they were going to get it in. He did it.
Including a test run, she wanted to move nearly 350,000 pills.
We estimated it had a street retail value of about $9 million. The first shipment came in June of 2001. But the big shipment they were talking about did not come until September.
The shipment arrived by way of the undercover agent just prior to 9/11. While the world stopped that day, Beatrice Hanau pushed to finish the deal in the face of chaos at Ground Zero. With authorities taping her phone calls in Amsterdam, she ordered a courier up from Colombia into the heart of Manhattan.
The courier had probably the most incriminating call in the whole case with Beatrice Hanau back in the Netherlands, where it was just very, very clear what everybody's role was, what her relationship to him was, meaning she was in charge. She said to him at one point something like, "We told you people are counting on us, like this is a big deal. You've got to go in there tomorrow and 1, 2, 3, make it happen."
The mayor took a close look at the pills police seized, a multicolored haul cops call the biggest ecstasy bust in city history.
This is among the most significant drug seizures that we've seen in recent years. A major distribution network has been put out of business.
Authorities arrested the courier in New York and rounded up the Colombian cell in the Netherlands. And now was arrested October 2nd, 2001, and jailed in Amsterdam.
We have an extradition treaty with the Netherlands, and we had already filled out requests. You know, we had made provisional arrest warrants. Within a week or something after those arrests, the Dutch let them go.
The Americans have a warrant on you, so what do? You decide, hey, forget this amphetamine stuff. I can do amphetamines, but I'm going to get into cocaine.
La Negra became a leading figure in one of the fiercest drug cartels on record. And a fugitive on the Interpol list of most wanted women in the world.
The Colombian cartels are enormous organizations with a hierarchy and structure and all kinds of workers, and it goes all the way back to the growers in the fields. Never heard of a woman being involved at that level.
The most infamous female gangster of the modern era came from Colombia. La Madrina, the godmother, Griselda Blanco.
Griselda Blanco was one of those pioneers that went into Miami in the 80s. and literally broke the glass ceiling in terms of female drug traffickers.
Colombian assassins bring to Miami a type of violence it has never seen before.
You think there isn't a woman who can compete in the tough and rough world of drug dealing? Go and look at Griselda, and she'll straighten you out very quickly on that.
She made her name selling cocaine and leaving a devastating trail of blood in her wake. 20 years later, another Colombian, Beatrice Elena Henao, would try to follow Griselda's rise to the top. In 2001, Henao was arrested in Amsterdam after trying to pull off the most ambitious ecstasy drug deal in U.S. history.
When they arrested them in the Netherlands, they seized a great deal of evidence. There were wiretap tapes, documents, and all that kind of stuff. So it was virtually an undefendable case in the United States for Beatrice Henao.
But she wasn't in the United States.
I will say that if I was giving advice to potential drug dealers, operate in the Netherlands or Norway or in one of these countries. I'm sorry to my European neighbors, but odds are you might have what happened to Beatrice Henao, which is they release her for insufficient evidence.
Her lawyers advised her to leave the country, Holland, because Holland had an extradition treaty with the United States. Where can she go? She go back to Colombia, right? That's, the place she knows. But Colombians been extraditing traffickers to the United States by the dozens over the last decade.
Henao went home, but she had protection.
She had been working with the Comba brothers, so she essentially goes to the Valle del Norte, one of the big cartels, and they say, we have this offshoot. It's called Los Rostros. You can run the international cocaine part of that. The guy who had been running it had just been murdered a month earlier in Mexico. And from essentially 2001, post 9/11, until 2008-9, she is running the drug operations from South America.
Over that time, the Comba brothers would become the biggest drug cartel in Colombia, the suppliers for the famed Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. With Beatrice as a top lieutenant, expanding the business.
The spread of the cartel is a direct threat to the safety and security of law-abiding citizens everywhere, and the money generated from their sales of illegal drugs are used to fund other criminal activities, extending their violent enterprises further into our heartland.
She was highly educated. She was a political science major.
She spoke 4 languages, Spanish, Dutch, English, and German. She had, really good business skills.
She also had a target on her back as one of the 10 most wanted on Interpol's list of dangerous women.
As far as I know, she didn't commit a murder, officially, because there's no record of it.
But the organization she worked for was rife with blood.
Authorities say the 23 bodies found near a dump site are drug gang related.
The U.S. appetite for drugs continues to feed the cartel battles in the $14 billion a year illegal trade.
She was a member of the Luis Cayacerna group,
AKA Los Comba, cocaine suppliers for both the Sinaloa cartel traffickers along Mexico's Pacific coast and Los Zetas, the violent gang controlling Mexico's border with Texas.
And any trafficker is going to have to engage in violence if they're involved in that type of activity to protect the enterprise at all costs.
And now spent 8 years flaunting her position to authorities.
Isn't the greatest thing if you keep too high a profile and you're wanted as a criminal? She refused to stay in anything less than a 5-star hotel whenever she traveled.
I have no idea how she lasted as long as she did without getting arrested.
September 1st, 2009, she was taken down like a kingpin. More than 30 federal agents, armed to the teeth, surrounded her in front of a pizzeria in Pereira, Colombia. She was staying at a 5-star hotel 2 doors down.
Colombia is a really good partner in extraditing people. They extradite 150 to 160 people a year.
La Negra has put on a plane to New York January 7th, 2011, wanted for a decade-old indictment in the biggest ecstasy drug deal in U.S. history.
That's someone who has no hope at trial. Her guilt was, to my mind, a foregone conclusion. But you're talking about selling $9 million worth of ecstasy. If you sell $9 million worth of cocaine, you're looking at a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence for sure, and probably a lot higher than that.
She's looking at 40 years to possibly life in prison, depending on the conviction. There's a very strange superstition that the Colombians have, which is that the first person extradited gets the benefit of a break, often. She was the first person extradited that year from Colombia.
The defense game plan for Beatrice Henao would be plead guilty and try to get the most lenient sentence you could.
A week into the trial, they announced the trial's over. We reached a guilty plea with the defendant. They give her 6 years. She'll be out in 2015. Now, officially, no deal was struck with her. It's hard for me to imagine that in the current anti-war climate, that we get a trafficker from Colombia, it's called the Queen of Amphetamines, and we do a soft deal with her unless she provided information about something else.
There is another lethal beauty that ran in La Negra's circles. While the Queen of Amphetamines was extradited to the United States in 2011, just 1 year later, the U.S. brought back the Queen of the Pacific to stand trial.
Mexican police called her the director of public relations of the biggest cartel in Mexico. She was a gangster. She was in jail, but she still had an image to protect.
A lot of the women who have come into the business in the past 15 years have come in to replace a husband or a brother or a son who has been killed by somebody else in the cartel or has gone to prison for a long time.
More than 50 alleged members of the dangerous Sinaloa cartel were arrested.
They have an option immediately. Do we allow the business that my son, brother, or husband built to be taken over by somebody else, or do I step in and run it? And some of them, without that real background, but they've been there as the spouse, the mother, or the sister, do step in and run it. In Sandra Beltran's case, she had that ambition from the very beginning, and she certainly showed it.
Her name is Sandra Avila Beltran, and she may be the most infamous lethal beauty in the modern world.
She used sexuality, you know, tight pants. She wore stiletto heels, you know, that alluring smile.
She was as ruthless as any male drug trafficker.
When you're dealing with someone as big as Sandra Beltran, chances are something bad's going to happen to you.
Indicted and charged with trying to import 100 kilograms of cocaine with a street value of $20 million. She herself told a judge in open court that she preferred to be called the Queen of the Pacific.
She is a one-of-a-kind.
Beltran is the unique product of Mexico's troubled history with narcotics. Her family tree is a who's who of big-time gangsters.
She's a third-generation trafficker. That helps to put her into the business.
She was related to Miguel Felix Gallardo, who was known as the godfather for drug trafficking in Mexico.
He's serving 40 years in a Mexican prison, in part for killing a DEA agent in 1985, torturing him and killing him.
They call him the Godfather, you know, just like the movie. Payan, her great uncle, he went down in 2008 and was extradited to the United States, and he's in jail now.
Her mother's side of the family, they used to be involved in heroin, but then they got into cocaine because it seemed a little bit more profitable.
She has family ties to the founder of the Guadalajara cartel and the Sinaloa cartel.
It's a pedigree that would rival the British royal family.
She was born in Baja, Mexico, in a fishing community along the western coast.
On the early 1990s, she marries somebody and she has a son with him. And that guy is a federal policeman.
Her husband, Jose Luis Fuentes, spoiled her, even sends her to Paris for the first time.
So now she goes from being at what I call a middle-class Guadalajara neighborhood to visiting Europe, buying real goods. Husband's a policeman on a $30,000 a year salary, but clearly getting money from somebody else.
Fuentes was found to be corrupt and eventually killed by his former colleagues in the force.
So she marries now somebody who's the director of the Institute for Controlling Narcotics. This is like a sub-level of the FBI. He's also dirty.
Rodolfo Lopez Amavisca was found murdered in a hotel room in Hermosillo, the victim of suspected drug runners.
By the time he's killed, it's not really important to her because she has become ambitious and she's gone down to Colombia.
Her next man confirmed her stature in the family business.
She actually got her start when she met an individual by the name of Ramirez.
Juan Diego Espinosa Ramirez, known as El Tigre, the Tiger.
It was through that relationship in which they were lovers that she actually started to expand into becoming a major female drug trafficker.
She says to them, hey, we need more cocaine up in Mexico. You want to work out a distribution deal with me? This is my lover. And they do it. It's fantastic. So she's called Queen of the Pacific in part because she's the one who arranges for these massive shipments of cocaine up to the north coast of Mexico and the west coast and then distributes them into the U.S.
Historically, Mexico, up until the mid-90s, were essentially second fiddle in the drug trade. For the most part, the Mexicans, worked at the beck and call of the Colombian drug traffickers. So you could see the incredible rise of the Mexican international drug trade.
It all began with the Queen of the Pacific.
They set up loads, they set up timetables, they have accountants, they have all of the components. And if they lose a load, that's just a cost of doing business.
By 2001, Beltran's activities are on the radar of U.S. law enforcement.
What became one of the biggest drug busts ever started out more than a year ago when federal agents boarded this ship off Mexico's Pacific coast. On board, they found 10 tons of cocaine.
Most times when the importations were taking place, it was on a go-fast boat. You'd get a few hundred kilos of cocaine.
A cooperator from Colombia confirmed to U.S. DEA agents that a major load was heading north.
He was able to identify to us it had left South America on board this fishing vessel by the name of Marcel. Now you're not talking hundreds of kilos, but thousands of kilos. What turned out to be over 9,000 kilos of, several tons of cocaine, which at the time, largest seizure recorded by DEA. You're talking tons, just literally tons and tons. I'm not familiar with the average weight of an elephant, but you're talking about a couple of elephants here. I mean, the amount of cocaine that was taken off of that ship, it just stretched for football fields along. And this is not small packages, but huge burlap wrap sacks of cocaine.
We can't pay off the federal police any longer because now there are DEA agents involved. And on the boat, they find all types of records for cell phones that tie to her and to tie to Espinosa Ramirez.
The people on the Marcel were not in control of the load. They were answering to somebody else, one of whom was Sandra Beltran.
She immediately started taking action against some of the authorities. She did have individuals killed that she felt were informants. So she did engage in violence.
She became a target for authorities and the lawless elements within her own country.
After the seizure, a couple months later, her son was kidnapped. She didn't know what to do, you know, because she's a, you know, gangster, right?
They know she has some money. They know she's on the run.
They found out what they were asking, $5 million. She was desperate, you know, to save her son.
Lethal Beauties. Rosalie Garcia, Beatrice Henao, and Sandra Beltran all held positions of great power within secret societies, renowned for ruthless bloodshed. They had one more trait in common.
They are mothers. At the time, they're dealing in drugs and murder, working in a man's world. But that's not stopping them.
Rosalie Garcia, her son was her right-hand man. He's now serving a life sentence along with his mother. Beatrice Henao did not directly employ her two sons, but she didn't do them any favors.
One of them is doing time for a murder in Spain. He actually got extradited out of Colombia, and the other's doing time for drug trafficking in the Netherlands. He got arrested at the airport with a whole bunch of drugs.
Sandra Beltran's son inadvertently helped reveal his mother as a major player in one of the most notorious drug cartels in the world. In December 2001, a fishing boat seized in Manzanillo, Mexico, netted a record bust. More than 9,000 kilograms of Colombian cocaine was set ablaze.
At first, she sort of was able to hide behind her status as a woman in what has traditionally been an organization run by men. She was the girlfriend. Nobody would suspect that a woman was in charge of the organization.
6 months later, her son disappeared from their home in Guadalajara.
That made the authorities realize that this was no ordinary woman.
If authorities weren't sure of her position within the cartel, they understood that she was a major player after the kidnapping. Her son's abductors demanded $5 million in ransom.
Obviously, they weren't going to ask for $5 million, you know, unless she had it.
The kidnappers had not targeted a girlfriend. They targeted the boss.
She was not there simply as the girlfriend watching, but rather she was there as the individual running the operation.
She negotiates the deal herself, and they release him for $3 million. And then she disappears again.
That's when the Mexican government started to investigate her in earnest. She brought, you know, millions, if not billions of dollars into the coffers of the Sinaloa cartel. And for that, she was called the Queen of the Pacific. Everybody recognized that she was the key person. So they were going to arrest her, but Mexico was so corrupt that she got word of it, and she disappeared.
During that time, she was indicted in Miami, the destination for the fishing boat and the 9,000 kilograms of cocaine.
We were targeting a cell that was in Miami that was receiving and distributing cocaine up the eastern seacoast and into the usual distribution routes that include New York and Chicago. Ultimately, your goal is to get the person at the top of the organization.
It wasn't that she was hiding like in the mountains, you know, Sierra Madre, right?
Most of these people don't seclude themselves in the middle of the jungle, contrary to what you see and read about the drug lords who have an enclave with golden statues in the middle of the jungle. She was living the life in the suburbs.
She's living under a false name in Mexico City, in the Palanca district, which is actually very upscale. She goes regularly to a high-end Chinese restaurant called Shea Wok.
They believe that they are immune from arrest and apprehension.
In Sandra Beltran's case, she was wrong. September 2007, the Queen of the Pacific is arrested by 30 federal agents in Mexico City.
Big news. The Queen Pin herself, the Queen of the Pacific, is arrested. And they also arrest her boyfriend, El Tigre.
¿De dónde eres? Colombia.
They put her into a jail, and they charge her in Mexico with money laundering, weapons possession, drug trafficking, and the 9 tons on the boat. And they have a trial.
You're going to read the charges to her, and she goes, I already know them. I already know them. Like she was, you know, in for a traffic violation.
In 2010, both Beltran and Ramirez are acquitted on the drug charges. The judge cited lack of evidence.
The prosecutors say, come on, you gotta be kidding.
She remained in custody on a weapons charge.
Her name is Sandra Avila Beltran. She's accused of trying to smuggle cocaine into the United States and is facing extradition.
She went to prison, and it became a spectacle in Mexico, like a soap opera, or a reality show, because you had this beautiful woman in jail. She complained about the food. She complained about everything.
She wears high heels. She's still allowed to wear her own shoes because she's paid somebody. But my favorite is that in 2011, the Daily Mail in England said that she's getting Botox in prison.
As a matter of fact, the warden of that particular penitentiary was dismissed as a result of that.
She was getting Botox so she could look good if she was extradited back to Miami.
In August of 2012, the Queen of the Pacific was put on a plane for South Florida. She now faces charges for conspiring to import and distribute cocaine into the United States.
Sandra Avila Beltran is one of the few narco queen pins, first of all, in existence, because there are very few women at her level of narcotics trafficking. I will follow that trial by probably going there daily. She's an astonishing case.
But her story may soon be replayed. In Brazil alone, there are more than 10,000 women behind bars in connection with the drug trade.
For the most part, women are used as couriers, but these 3 women knew how to manipulate their counterparts. They knew how to deal with rival gangs, and they knew how to exploit men to do their bidding.
It's an ongoing battle that takes place. And right now, the next Sandra Beltran's learning the tricks of the trade, learning how this operates, what the next drug of choice is going to be. And 10, 15 years from now, they'll be talking about somebody else.